So in a minute we'll be, we are live now. So hello everyone. We're just waiting for it to turn 4 o'clock. So let's see, we get a bit of chat coming in. Okay. If you're watching it now, you might notice my freedom of speech poster by Norman Rockwell, done in 1941, in response to Franklin Roosevelt's Four Freedoms speech. Peter Crawford. Hello, Peter. Two minutes to go. Okay. We're just waiting for the clock to strike 4, then we'll start. To anybody who's looking. Okay. All right, well, I might as well just start the intro, Jim.
Fire away.
Well, to anybody who's watching, thank you for joining us. This is the Blackheath Philosophy Forum. So if you're wondering, in from some distant corner of cyberspace, Blackheath is in the Upper Blue Mountains of New South Wales, Australia. And normally we have physical meetings to hold these forums, but needless to say, under current circumstances, that's not possible. So we've decided to do it by video streaming, and this is the second video streamed forum. I have to apologise at the outset that our scheduled speaker, who was Dr. Caroline West, has been laid low by a migraine, which knowing somebody who's suffered very badly from that, I can well understand that it would be a problem. So I'd like to wish Caroline well and hope for a speedy recovery. And she's indicated we might be able to reschedule it at a future date. So we just received that information this morning. So Jim Allen, who was our first speaker, has agreed to very kindly to come in at very short notice and talk about free speech and hate speech, which was the topic, broadly speaking, that Caroline was going to be talking about. And Jim Allen, if you are not familiar with him or you didn't watch the first video, is the Garrick Professor of Law at the University of Queensland. He's published extensively on political philosophy and constitutional law. And he's been published in all the major journals on those topics internationally, including US, Canada, Australia, and Britain. So thank you very much, Jim. The format basically is Jim is going to talk for a fairly short period, say 15 minutes. Then there'll be a period where I ask him questions, predominantly to try and elaborate on particular points or to raise possible objections. During this period, you can post through the chat window, and once we get through the two steps I've just described, we'll start to highlight some of the chat comments to which Jim will be able to respond. So that's the basic format, and I'd ask Jim to open up. Thank you, Jim.
Well, thank you, Peter. And let me just apologize to everyone for being here a second time. I'm a late fill-in. Yeah. So what I thought I'd do is talk about a certain sub-branch of the free speech debate, which is hate speech laws. I think the speaker you're going to have would be more sympathetic to these hate speech laws than I am. I'm not sympathetic at all. But I'll try to just set out the ways that you might go about defending hate speech laws say a couple of words about why I don't think they work very well. I probably am going to have to deke out about 20 after 5. So Peter said he could then continue on. So that's about, 20 minutes after the hour. So again, often when you're arguing about free speech, you end up having an argument in terms of likely consequences. And as I mentioned last week, the John Stuart Mill line is that when you weigh up all the consequences, you would normally find that allowing people to speak, when you look at how the competition for ideas drives beneficial change, when you look at the fact that when you give real life government officials a gatekeeping role, they tend to be very heavy-handed. For all sorts of reasons, you'd want to have a lot of scope for speaking your mind. And most people do not take that to mean they would put no limits on speech. I think almost everyone except a few dyed-in-the-wool libertarians would say there are some types of speech we would suppress, inciting violence, direct incitements of violence, revealing CIA agents' names where they're going to get killed. Also, we can come up with lots, child pornography. But normally, when you say you're in favor of free speech, you're at that end of the spectrum where you would put few and far between limits on speech. Again, it's a spectrum, so we're not talking none versus all. And then along that spectrum somewhere comes the question of hate speech, which is speech that attacks people or groups. Some people might say you're diminishing their dignity, or you're going after them in ways that humiliate them. So you might even go as soft as to say that you're you're offending them. And the question then is, how does the cost-benefit analysis, the consequentialist analysis, work with hate speech laws? Now, a well-known New Zealander come Oxford professor or Oxford student under Ronald Dworkin come quite a famous American philosopher and jurist, Jeremy Waldron, wrote a book, The Harm in Hate Speech, a few years back, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And his basic line, he was trying in a sort of soft, quiet way to defend, or at least to moot the possibility of defending hate speech laws. And his basic idea was that when you're weighing up the costs and benefits, hate speech is a harm. And I agree with him on that. I think people who say that hate speech has no harm in it at all are just wrong. The question is, are there compensating benefits for letting those sort of people speak? I'd say yes. But Waldron's line was basically that you can, if you have a circumscribed sort of package of hate speech laws, you might be able to boost the dignity of, let's say the speech is aimed at a vulnerable minority group, you might be able to boost their dignity. And so the idea then is by putting, and Waldron doesn't want to include laws that offend. So even defenders of hate speech would say that Australia's Section 18C is crazy. I mean, the idea that you would put limits on people based on some other people saying they're offended seems pretty much crazy to any American law professor. But hate speech laws, Waldron might try to defend on the basis that if they're carefully articulated, then they might boost the dignity of minority groups who are, on his model, the subject of these sort of this sort of speech. And then the question is, what do you mean by dignity? And that's a lot harder to cash out than just throwing around the term might suggest. It's very hard to articulate what you mean by dignity and how these kind of laws are going to enhance dignity. But let's say that you can get over that hurdle. Then the question is, how do hate speech laws, and they would be not as encompassing as ours, but how would a properly framed hate speech law boost the dignity of some group that's being the victim of such speech? So how would you assure them good standing in the community? And when I reviewed Waldron's book, there's 3 things you might say. If someone says, how are your hate speech laws boosting the dignity of this group that's under attack. One possible answer is, well, look, the problem with hate speech, what a hate speech laws do is it suppresses information. So the group that would otherwise know that there were some neo-Nazis out there who hated them, because of hate speech laws, that speech is suppressed, and this particular group never finds out that there are these neo-Nazis who hate them. And that's not much of an answer, because I don't think that's the sort of rationale that Waldron would want. That's a sort of willful blindness argument that you're better off as some particular group, not knowing that there's 0.1% of the population out there that hates you. I suspect on any cost-benefit analysis, you'd be better off knowing there's a group that hates you. So that's usually not what's meant. The second possibility is that these hate speech laws, by silencing some neo-Nazi or radical Islamic cleric or whatever, actually might improve the speaker. So somewhere down the road, the speaker, because of the hate speech laws and the fact that he or she can't speak, will become a better, less hateful human being. Again, very implausible, and almost no one thinks that. You could cash it out in more sophisticated terms by saying, it's not that he'll become better, it's that these hate speech laws act as a sort of old-fashioned politeness sort of bar. And so what you're doing is you're teaching people that there is ways to speak and ways not to speak. Probably, again, weak. And then that leaves a third possibility, and this is usually what most people mean, and that's that hate speech laws help the vulnerable minority group. And the reason they do is because the people who push hate speech laws don't trust the listeners. So they're not so much worried about the speaker, and they're not so much worried about the group that's having to hear these nasty things about them. What the people who promote these laws are worried about is that the 99% of the population who hears the hate speech, well, they'll be convinced by it, or some percentage of them will be convinced by it. And so it's a sort of, I don't trust my fellow citizens, and so we better keep this information from the listener. And that's normally the underlying justification. It's not the only, there are people out there who don't take that line, but the vast preponderance of people who support hate speech laws, their real motivation is that if this speech were to get out there amongst the sort of hoi polloi, the deplorables, they would be convinced. There's some significant percentage or a worrying percentage of people out there who would hear this would be convinced by it. And so we have to suppress the speech for that reason. And so they cash it out that way. And I think there are problems with that. Now, if you're a certain sort of person, that's a knockout argument. So if you're not overly keen on democracy and you really do think there's sort of a group at the top of society, elites, experts who have access, or they're more adept at processing information, and those sort of people you can trust the information with, but others you can't, this sort of argument will work with them. If you don't trust your fellow citizens, of course, it's hard to be a Democrat. It's hard to leave major social policy decisions to a process in which everyone counts equally and we all get a vote to choose representatives. So it's pretty hard to support hate speech laws. And implicitly, you'd sort of have to then want to say, look, I want a lot of the major decisions in society to be taken by unelected judges under some sort of Bill of Rights regime, or bureaucrats or judges who are appealing to international law. So in other words, you want to take at least some decisions off the democratic table. And of course, that is happening everywhere today. That is one of the trends we're seeing around the democratic world. So that sort of fits with people who don't have a lot of confidence in their fellow citizens. If you do have confidence in your fellow citizen, then the argument that we have to suppress speech because these raving neo-Nazis are going to convince a lot of people is far less convincing. Or these mad clerics who are preaching jihadi messages are going to convince a lot of people, going to be less convincing. But the underlying premise of people who push hate speech laws is often, not always, but as I said, often, that they're afraid that the message is going to be convincing to at least some group of people. Now, often you will get a sophisticated version of this where someone might say, and Waldron sort of does this too, it's not that you can't convey your message which I think is hateful. It's that you have to do it in a sophisticated way. So in other words, what they're saying is, if you want to say that the birth rate amongst recent Muslim immigrants to Europe is worryingly high, well, you can make that in a very sort of academic, highbrow way, but you can't make it in a more down-to-earth sort of way that would be the sort of thing that would be easily understandable and heard amongst the sort of deplorable everyday citizen crowd. And again, the problem with that is what you're really seeing is there's more speech for articulate people with PhDs than there is for lesser articulate, less well-educated people. Now, in my view, there's a real consequentialist sort of sting in the tail of that sort of argument, because what it's trying to do is take a sort of national front type argument and stick a more sophisticated sort of leader on it. And that might really have really bad consequences. It might be that when you're getting the message in the sort of down-home way, people can see it's really bad message and they can counteract it. But when you put a sort of more dressed up Marie Le Pen daughter in front of the message, it might actually have more ability to sway people. And so maybe we ought not to be suppressing the speech in the first place, or forcing it to be articulated in, dressed up terms. I would say that's very likely, but I'm just giving you this sort of line that you'll often get with hate speech people. Other approaches to hate speech are to say perhaps that, it really doesn't have that many effects. You're not really creating that many martyrs. And often they will point to say the fact that in Australia or Canada, let's take Canada, my native Canada, there's only really been one criminal prosecution of any note in the last 20, 25 years. Often the criminal prosecutions require the consent of the Attorney General, who hardly ever gives it. You get the Zundel case, he was convicted. Again, I think I mentioned that last week. He had a small little magazine that nobody read, and then after he was convicted, a lot of people read it. But that's in Australia, Canada, and much of the world. That is not where most of the hate speech laws actually have real effect. They're more of the work is being done in the sort of administrative realm, like our Section 18C. There was an equivalent provision in Canada, but the Harper government in a private member's bill actually repealed it because of the Mark Steyn saga, where Mark Steyn and the magazine, the Weekly Maclean's, were threatening to take the case right up to the Supreme Court. And so the government or the people bringing the alleged complaint caved in. And then on a private member's bill, the government voted the equivalent of our Section 18C out of existence. And even Trudeau hasn't brought them back in, interestingly. There's a lot of provincial human rights type commissions with this jurisdiction, but nothing nationally. So when we get to question time, if anyone wants to talk about Section 18C, there's lots of aspects of it we could talk about. I think they're incredibly sweeping because they include offense, which effectively gives alleged victims a veto. They include humiliation. You can't really put a piece of paper between offense and humiliation. So very subjective. The Section 18D defense was massively read down by, I think it was Bromberg was the justice in the Bolt case. Wrong legal analysis in my view. I think I mentioned that last week, but that's the state of play right now until someone takes a case above that. And then you get the whole thing that's sort of off the radar, and people who defend hate speech laws never talk about this. But once you get a Bolt-like case, or the 3 students at Queensland University of Technology, people start to self-censor themselves. Networks start to stop people from speaking. Individuals censor themselves. And so people go, oh, look, there's no problem. And the problem is that, yes, there is a problem. It's just that you can't see it because people are censoring themselves. You can see that there was a problem with our hate speech laws when the Race Relation Commissioner, Tim I can't ever say his name. I've got to sit down and learn. Palmisani was effectively soliciting for complainants against Bill Leak, which obviously was quite disturbing to leak. It wasn't too many weeks after that he had a heart attack and died, which was quite sad. He was a great cartoonist. His son's getting a lot better, actually. And so those are the sorts of issues that are in play with hate speech laws. Of course, in the US, it's all moot because with their First Amendment jurisprudence, you have there's just no chance at all of having any kind of hate speech law withstand constitutional investigation. So there are no hate speech laws in the US. I always like to remind people that even though in the US legally and constitutionally there's more scope to speak your mind than anywhere in the planet, you can't say anything, there's limits, but there's the most scope. In a day-to-day practical sense, if you are a professor at an American university, the scope to speak your mind is less than here in Australia. The campus cancel culture in the US and the fear of the university sort of stamping on you is so high that although you have constitutional protections in a real day-to-day sense, some of the universities are so crazy that there's a lot you can't say in a practical sense. I mean, you could say it legally, but then you'd be under such pressure that you might not even hold your job. And that's happened at a university in Washington, Green something or other, Evergreen State or something. We saw it at Yale with an academic saying that maybe the university ought not to be intruding on the kind of Halloween costumes people wear. And that led to such an outroar at Yale that the academic and her husband, and also an academic, had to take a payoff to go somewhere else. So you always have to keep in your mind, what are the constraints that flow from the constitutional and legal regime in play in your jurisdiction? And separately, what are the constraints on your speech that flow from the culture of the day and the sort of often internet-driven limits on what you can speak? They're not legal limits, but they're very effective limits on what people will say. So again, hate speech laws are a subset of your larger debate about free speech generally. If you're in Europe, you'll find that many countries have some pretty vigorous hate speech laws, and I mean talking about the democratic world. Britain has some shocking sort of limits on speech in their public offense order, whatever it is. We're not great with the hate speech law. Section 18C should go. If we had a right of center political party that believed in any first order principles at all, they would get rid of it. Again, Mr. Turnbull tried, but the Senate blocked it. I think Mr. Abbott found that most of his party room were against, and shamefully he caved in on that. He shouldn't have. I think he admits he shouldn't have. And Mr. Morrison seems to, I think he said it was a third order issue, which is, as I said last week, is just wrong. So those are the usual kind of arguments you'll get in favor of hate speech laws. Alas, they are the majority view in law schools around Australia and the common law world. It's not quite the same in the US, because in the US, since people know that there's no hope to have any actual law withstand constitutional challenge, nobody even tries to bring them in. They just try to deal with people informally through the culture and through shouting them down. Is there anything in particular you wanted me to cover, Peter, other than that?
Oh, no, that's fine. That's good as an intro. Isn't there an additional aspect of the case that's you often hear, and the idea that hate speech laws, even if they're never invoked or rarely invoked, have the effect of delegitimizing certain categories of speech. And I think that paper by Catherine Gelber we discussed on the phone makes the point that the very existence of such provisions provides a degree of comfort to groups that, are typically the target of hate speech, so-called.
Yeah, I mean, I don't agree. She's at my university. She's a nice woman. I don't agree with her. First of all, there's the self-censorship. And then there's always the question that these sort of arguments finesse that maybe some of the speech, we don't know what percentage, but even if it's a small percentage of the speech, it might be true. And so the example you might get is one that it's not mine. I've read it elsewhere, but I mean, if you run against speech that is categorized as hateful, what if it's true? And do you really want to limit speech that's true? And of course, some people will answer yes, because some things that offend people, humiliate people, or even sort of make them feel like a member not in good standing in the community, so undermines their dignity, might be true. This is more easily cashed out in terms of questions related to religion, obviously, than it is questions related to race. But someone like Charles Murray, who comes along and makes arguments about IQ based on, social science studies that sort of lump people into different groups, and then says some groups do better than others statistically, is that hateful speech? And nobody wants to talk about the underlying question of what if some of this speech is true? And then the secondary question is, what about what happens when people start to self-censor and they won't speak because they're afraid of how they're going to be portrayed? And so I think it's easy to say, oh, this is just, all this is doing is delegitimizing. But the way it works and the reason it delegitimizes is because you attack people for speaking, and often, or at least sometimes, for saying things that are true. And usually the kind of people who are quite insouciant about these laws, deep down, there's very little chance that their views will ever be delegitimized. So what they're delegitimizing are views other than their own. And so I just still go back to saying, if a view is that obviously suspect, why don't we just tell people why it's suspect? That way we don't need gatekeepers. That way we don't need people to say, look, I'm not letting you speak, but don't worry. All I'm really doing is delegitimizing a view of yours that I think is worthy of delegitimizing. So by definition, not my own. Again, you get the heavy hand of the state. Most of the problem with Section 18C in this country is off ledger. People just want to settle. They don't want to go in and find that the person who's making the complaint gets their costs paid for by the state. They have to pay. It's just easier to pay to make the thing go away. And so, sure, you can't easily point to people who are the objects of these terrible laws. I mean, we can point to the QUT students, we can point to Bill Leak, we can point to Andrew Bolt, but not too many, because mostly your average person just doesn't want to deal with the administrative state. So they just shut up and they pay and they go away. And then the Human Rights Commission, which administers this, goes soliciting for more because all bureaucracies are looking for work, and it's not a good thing.
Yeah, it's the Human Rights Commission argues that it's a virtue of the way they operate that the vast majority of cases don't end up being adjudicated; they're just settled by some confidential conciliation process, and the only cases that become highly prominent are the ones where the person accused decides to fight it and take it all the way to court. This happened in the QUT case.
And they fight it having to pay their own legal costs, or else rely on some benevolent barrister who does the work pro bono. That's what happened to the QUT students. Luckily, they found a barrister who's prepared to take their case for nothing, but you can't count on that. And meanwhile, the complainant is basically covered by the Human Rights Commission. So all the litigation on that side is paid for by the taxpayers, in effect. And it's not a virtue when you effectively are sort of pressing people into settlements, because anybody who makes a cost-benefit analysis of how much it's going to cost them and what they can just pay to make it all go away, well, most people will just opt for the latter.
Yeah, I mean, the QUT case illustrates those points very clearly. There were 6 students who were accused of hate speech, and 2 of them decided to fight it. The others apparently coughed up $5,000 to make it go away, but the students who fought it ultimately won in the federal court. But it was a kind of a Pyrrhic victory because their lives were massively disrupted for a 2-year period. These are young students just nearing the end of their course. And Andrew Wood, whose high crime was to post something on Facebook that said, after being expelled from a computer room that was reserved for indigenous students, he posted something on Facebook. These 6 words: QUT fighting segregation by using segregation.
Yep.
QUT using segregation to fight segregation. Okay, that's what he posted. In the end, he ended up having to fork out some tens of thousands of dollars because of irrecoverable costs. Even though
I thought he got his legal costs for free, but you're right. He did have to fork out some. Did he have to pay $10,000? I didn't think it was that much.
Well, the report I saw was a lot more than that.
Right.
Whether the barrister was representing him insisted on recovering. But can I just come back?
Let me just say that the other student, and I think 3 of them fought it at first, but the second one, it turned out that he was alleged to have said he hadn't even, someone had hacked into his account, so he hadn't said anything, and he was stuck having to fight this.
Yeah, so the old saying, the process is the punishment, really.
That's the Mark Stein line, and that's what it is.
Yeah. If you get dragged into litigation about this sort of stuff, and even if you ultimately win in scare quotes, the smart students, from a self-interested point of view, were the ones who just submitted and just
they submitted. Nobody knows who they are.
Sorry,
and they get anonymity too, because nobody knows who they are, which is probably in their best interest in a weird kind of way. You need to run up against a real contrarian like Mark Stein or Andrew Bolt, or somebody who's just saying, I'm not going to settle.
Or someone who's got a big media organization standing behind them, like Bill Leak.
They will, although again, they have insurance, and often the insurance companies are pushing for a settlement.
Yeah, okay. Just just mention a few other arguments that come up. Caroline West, who should have been speaking today, but she had a migraine headache and was unable to. She wrote a paper called "Words That Silence," and she's got an interesting take on it. She contends that it's not just a question of the direct harms that can flow from hate speech. She contends that hate speech of certain kinds can actually diminish the free speech rights of some classes of people, i.e. the targets of the hate speech, and do it in a variety of ways, by dehumanizing them, by creating a state of affairs where things they might utter are not taken seriously, and not because they're devalued. So in other words, people who are subject to this can be deprived of an audience, and she argues that the ability to access an audience is a key aspect of free speech. Free speech.
Yeah, I mean, I think
shouting to you've got to have an audience somehow.
But that's premised on the view that if some neo-Nazi starts saying some crazy things about Jews, that the people who hear him will believe him. You're only dehumanizing people if your belief is that at least some percentage of the listening audience will believe the hate speaker. If you find that you have a bit of confidence in your fellow citizens to see through the octogenarian neo-Nazis' ravings, then you're not dehumanizing anyone. What the underlying worry is that this sort of speech will be believed. Now, one reason speech can be believed is because it's true. So let's say in 1 out of 100 cases, speech that's deemed to be hateful actually is true, maybe on demographic trends in Europe of Muslim people, because they're very high, right? And that's often characterized as hate speech. And you could say, well, all I've said is the truth. But normally, let's assume it's not true. And what you're talking about is speech that would be categorized as dehumanizing, because what you're worried about is that the people who hear the speech believe it. And the one response to that is, well, no, you have to have a bit of confidence if you have so little confidence in your fellow citizens, then it's not clear how you can even afford them the power to choose who the leaders are going to be. Because if they're that incompetent politically, morally, and in every other way, then you really ought not to be part of the crowd who thinks the best way to make calls in a Western sort of developed country is to have a democratic system, because you're giving them a heck of a lot of a say when you have votes. And so the argument that this sort of speech might be effective because it dehumanizes people is premised on the view that the people hearing it, or at least some significant chunk of them, are going to believe it and act on it. And so that's probably where I get off the boat right at the first step. Another answer you might go is, well, look, of course, when you're doing the cost benefit of analysis.
Jim, can I just interrupt you briefly there? The argument would be that the people concerned are highly underprivileged, might have very poor educational levels, lack social self-confidence, and very vulnerable to being told that what they have to say is of no value. That would be the argument, as I understand.
Well, that argument works again on two bases. I mean, the harm to them, if you assume that nobody in the listening group believes the speech, the harm is pretty low. It might be so if we say that, okay, look, I don't think any people hearing the speech are going to believe it, then what is the harm to the group you're speaking to? Well, it's a psychological harm to their own sense of self-worth. And then again, you get into the questions I talked about last week about do you want the government to step in and help people who have an overrated ability to see themselves as victims? And again, there is harm to them. They do feel a certain harm, but that sort of harm also has counterbalancing benefits, in the sense that you're living in a free speech without relying on some government official to be the gatekeeper. I think the argument probably normally is premised on a subsidiary point that the person pushing this argument tends to think that some people in the audience will believe it, right? So you can imagine two scenarios. One is, let's say the speech is demeaning. Situation A, nobody in the audience believes it. They all think the speaker's a moron, but you've hurt the group that hears it. And I think the harms there are pretty low, and they're overwhelmingly outweighed by just the sort of process harms that are going to be created by having some government official there to be the gatekeeper. They'll always be officious and overbearing. The other scenario is where you say, okay, yes, it's demeaning speech. And not only do the people who hear it suffer these psychic sort of offense harms, some percentage of the group that's listening, who's not the target of the speech, will be convinced by it. And I think that's normally implicitly what the defenders of these hate speech laws are saying. They have a pretty low view of their fellow man, at least those who haven't got PhDs and work at a university or whatever. And they might not say that, but it's implicit in making their arguments sort of more plausible, I think. Again, if you imagine a situation where nobody believes the speaker, then the harm to the group that hears it is it's there, but it's pretty low. And it's not clear to me that you want to set up the organs of the state to come and suppress that speech, because some people have a pretty, because of a lack of education and not the sort of best socioeconomic sort of upbringing, have a certain sort of lack of resilience. That is not what you should be doing, in my view. We might do them more favors by letting the people speak and having people respond to them.
The Bill Leak case is interesting on a number of levels. The Bill Leak, for anybody coming from overseas who isn't familiar with it, was a cartoon that was posted in the Australian, or the main national daily, which depicted a scene where young Aboriginal children were running amok in the middle of the night, and a policeman who also happens to be an Aboriginal was saying to the father of one of these children, he's upbraiding the father. Anyway, it was a cartoon that depicted this, but it was a very hard-edged cartoon. But again, the issue there was that what the scene it was depicting actually reflected reality, okay? So it was making a reflection on cultural norms in remote Aboriginal communities, but it reflected reality. So the responses to it from indigenous people were quite interesting. The predominant response was, say, this is terrible racism. But then there were dissident voices, people like Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine, who said, well, look, it's just drawing attention to an appalling situation that exists on some of these remote communities, which are sort of dystopian hellholes of alcohol and substance abuse and violence and so forth. And if we're honest, and if we have a genuine concern with the people who live in these communities, there's a need for some honest consideration of what's going on there, rather than pretend that it's not happening. You know, and it was making a point, this cartoon, that was made in far more detailed form by an anthropologist and linguist called Peter Sutton, who several years ago wrote a book called The Politics of Suffering, which he'd had 30 years of association with the Aboriginal community in Arakan, I think it was. And he said that there'd been a colossal deterioration in living conditions in some of these communities since the valorization and celebration of traditional culture as the potential way to deal with the disabilities and disadvantage of Aboriginal communities. So you had a distinct split in Aboriginal communities in their response to this, which reflected a view that there is a real problem with violence in these communities, which is not solely the result of colonialism. But we haven't been able to deal with this effectively because it's been impossible to have an honest conversation. So there's a case of a truth, the suppression of which severely disadvantages the people, you know, who are supposedly the beneficiaries of hate speech provisions.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I agree with that. And I think Bill Leak even was careful to make one of the police officers Aboriginal. So it was a much more sophisticated cartoon than. At heart, the problem is that some people don't want to counter claims. And again, a lot of the claims implicit in the cartoon were actually true, but they don't want to counter that by saying, here's why we think your claim is overstated or untrue. Instead, they resort to what you might think of as a sort of promiscuous use of labels like racist or racism. Or there's all sorts of ways these days, you see it all over the place, where people try to silence others in what we used to call, when I was growing up, ad hominem arguments. Today, that seems to be fine. It seems to be an accepted mode of argument these days to not respond to the substance of any claim, but to go straight after the speaker. So you might say he or she's a racist. You might say, oh, this is just another example of white privilege, which means that anyone who's white can't make any comments on anything. If it's a man, you might say he's mansplaining. There's innumerable examples of it, and they all boil down to silencing people because you can't respond to their arguments. Now, we all know, anyone with a brain, it's the same in my native Canada, we all know that the way the governments have tried to deal with Aboriginal sort of social science, or not social science, the way governments have tried to deal with underprivilege in native communities. So they have appalling social science statistics: teenage poverty, alcoholism, lack of jobs. It's terrible across the board. And, it's probably, we can at least debate how wise it is to have policies where you basically try to stamp out all individual initiative by having group title instead of personal title. And you force people to have to share, you kill incentive. You have a set of policies that seem to be designed by people who haven't watched what's happened to centralized collective ownership over the last 100 years. Those societies don't do very well. And so I think you can make lots of arguments that to some extent, Aboriginal people have been the victim of guilty white liberals who've imposed policies on them that don't work. And I'm happy to have that argument. People might not like that argument, but I think there's something to it. I tend to buy what Gary Johns writes, who's spent a lot of time looking at these policies. But that doesn't mean he's right, but I don't see why you'd want to silence him. And so the first way to start the argument is to at least start setting out where the problems are. And if you can't even set out where the problems are, it may well be that to have a first world lifestyle, it's very difficult to live 3,000 miles away from anybody who's not in a city. To some extent, the modern lifestyle that delivers incredible wealth is premised on most people living in cities. And it may well be exceptionally difficult to try to deliver that. It's hard to come up with jobs in remote areas unless you happen to be living on a mine site. And when you do happen to be living near a mine site, the Greens come in and they make it impossible for the jobs that would flow from the mine site. Many of those jobs will go to Aboriginals, and now you can't even do that. So there's all sorts of things we could talk about, but it's pretty hard to have a discussion where people don't want to allow you to point to facts. Facts are usually what drives answers. And if you're met with not a rebuttal on the facts, but rather he's a racist. I don't even know what it means anymore to be called a racist. In the 60s, to call someone a racist meant that he was judging people based on their genetic material that had created a person over criteria and characteristics over which people have no control. And so you're judging them based on the happenstance of how they happen to have been born. And that's different than saying that you're not a very hardworking person. I mean, I guess you could become a complete determinist and say that genes determine everything about you, in which case anything you say about someone, in a sense, boils down to being a claim about their genes. But if we leave aside that and we think that there's any sort of scope for people to improve their position, then you ought to be able to criticize people on bases related to their culture, their lack of initiative, whatever, because the goal is to make life better for them. So I agree with you. I think the outrage that was directed at Bill Leak was really, in a way, confected outrage that was aimed at silencing the honest attempt, rightly or wrongly on the facts, to point out deficiencies in what's going on. Because the goal, of course, is to fix it.
Okay, well, look, we've got heaps of chat comments coming in. A lot of them are comments rather than questions. I'll try and find some questions or issues.
Just put the nice comments on, Peter.
Sorry?
Just put the nice comments on. Suppress all the bad comments.
Oh,
treat them as hate speech and just suppress them.
Right. Okay. Well, here's one from Philosophy and Critical Thinking, which is the nom de guerre for a member of our local organising committee. You don't trust fellow citizens is a bit uncharitable. Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent can explain misleading people without dismissing them as deplorable.
Well, sure. I mean, if you buy the Noam Chomsky line, then that's true. If you see people as fairly passive agents who aren't able to really, that are easily led. The problem with those kind of arguments always seems to me to be that you always have to imagine two groups. There's the group that somehow can rise above this, and they are able to see clearly, like Chomsky. I mean, I don't think Chomsky thinks that he's a sort of passive agent of forces. And then you've got all the people who aren't able to do this. And we characterize all those people as, rather than what I would have said is that you're seeing them as deplorable. And I would stand by that. I think that Chomsky line, Chomsky is a great academic when it comes to understanding linguistics, but he's just a dyed-in-the-wool crazy Marxist, in my view, when it comes to any views about politics, and I'd be happy to debate that. But my view about Chomsky is if someone's relying on Chomsky to make an argument, it's a bit like relying on Peter Van Onselen. It's probably wrong. Every transit of Venus, it might be right, but the track record is bad. And Chomsky basically brings a sort of warmed up Marxist view to the table, I think. Again, if you imagine that people can be sort of fooled into not knowing their own best interest, then that requires you to believe that some group of people are able to overcome that, and they can see it, someone whose name is Noam Chomsky, and that is always a hard argument to cash out. Why is it you think you're able to do this and they're not? And I want to say that it's implicitly treating them as deplorables, and you're not a deplorable. But if you think that's too harsh, fine. I think that's implicit in any of those kinds of arguments. But there you go. I recognize that he's a very influential figure. I don't think it's been for the good. I think it's definitely not been for the good, but it's a bit like most of the French philosophers, problematic.
Ruth Houseman says, Does hate speech appeal to emotion? Emotion is inseparable from the body in which it is felt, and emotion is also the basis for our engagement with the world.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure. I think all speech that's effective to some extent appeals to emotion. If you go and read Cicero, he appeals to emotion. If you do moral philosophy and you read David Hume thinks that the passions, emotion, feelings are much more important in the life of the mind than reason is. I tend to think he's right on that. So, of course, in one way, all speech that attempts to motivate people or change people to a large degree, or at least to some degree, relies on emotion. And that's, if you're a Humean, that's not a bad thing. It's emotion that moves action. Reason is just an ability to calculate likely future consequences for Humeans. And so in that sense, you would say, well, hate speech does rely on emotion, just as, the guy who's just as John F. Kennedy, when he stands up and says, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. That's not an appeal to sort of Einsteinian reason. It's appeal to emotion. It's appeal to your latent patriotism, and it's a good thing. And so, of course, all speech to some extent appeals to emotion. If you don't think that, I think it's very difficult to see how you can move anyone to do anything. If reason is a pretty desiccated, dry thing. It can tell you how to get from A to B, but it can't tell you why B is a destination you really want to get to. And so, yes, of course, in one sense, hate speech appeals to emotion, as does the speech that's countering hate speech. When you stand up and explain why the neo-Nazi is wrong, and you point out that, yes, there were tens of millions of deaths, it's not that fact, it's the underlying emotion that you're relying on the hearer to not want there to be 10 million deaths of innocent people. And you're assuming they have that underlying sentiment. If they don't have that underlying sentiment, the factual argument is not really going to get you anywhere.
Okay, next, Marika George Bowman. Ray, not trusting fellow citizens. What about hate speech triggering violent action by someone who sees it as permission?
Well, again, yes, if you think that somebody who listens to speech that someone would characterize as hate speech is going to treat that as a license to go and beat people up, then yes, that's a harm. And it's probably true. In a country of 320 million people in the US, occasionally people are triggered to go and kill people. Nobody really talks about when it's a Democrat who goes and shoots the Republican congressman. So it's usually painted only as coming from one side of politics. You rarely hear the argument cashed out as crazy rap artists or radical black Islamic preachers. But I think you have to admit that hate speech is a harm, and it occasionally will cash out in action. But it doesn't cash out in action very often. And when it does cash out in action, people forget that there's a lot of harm in trying to have a heavy-handed government step in and stop it. And the harms are bigger. I mean, that's the consequentialist argument. Anyone who says that hate speech has no harms, I think it's such an implausible argument. So you have to concede that, almost all speech can have harms. And so the question is, where are you going to opt to have the heavy hand of government or one of its agencies step in to suppress speech, knowing that governments are, they're always over-inclusive and under-inclusive. They get it wrong as much as they get it right. And there are really big costs involved in stepping in and trying to silence people. Now, one of the costs is that you drive the speech underground. And in a way, you turn them into martyrs. And indeed, you sometimes make them more popular. It's not like there are no voices in Germany that are voicing the neo-Nazi position, right? So hate speech doesn't end the view. What it does is it drives it underground. And that's a cost. And we have to weigh up, right? And as I said, I'd be the first one to suppress speech in some instances. Again, if someone somehow discovered how to make a weapon that would end all life on Earth with just things you could find in your kitchen, I would suppress that speech. I might even go so far as to lock that person up for life in solitary confinement, because really the costs are so high. So yes, there will be speech where we all say, look, not all of us, there are some libertarians who wouldn't limit any, but normally any sensible person, we're talking about where you find yourself on the spectrum. The problem with people who want to suppress hate speech is they're suppressing so much speech that the consequences aren't very good. I mean, again, here's an example I use. Often you'll hear people say, well, the problem with hate speech is it'll make groups like Muslims feel like disadvantaged groups in society. But if you say, okay, well, look at the United States where there's no hate speech laws at all because of the way the First Amendment's been interpreted, and compare that to countries in Europe with extremely harsh hate speech laws like Germany, like France, and then ask yourself, as a Muslim, where would you rather live, the United States or France or Germany? And I don't think too many people are going to answer France or Germany. And so, to some extent, Muslims in the US, they get to be a little bit more vigorous, and they're able to function in a society where people can say nasty things about them. True. But on the other hand, they become, active agents in society. And it's not obvious to me that the hate speech laws in France have done a very good job in integrating Muslims into the culture. And partly, if you treat people as victims the minute they get off the plane, you're going to have really big problems down the road. But that's just my view. It's a minority view, my view. I have to admit it. But I always ask for examples, and usually people want to talk about groups like, say, Islamic people, and you say, okay, well, look at minority groups of Muslims in the US and compare it to countries with really strong hate speech laws, and it's not at all obvious that you would pick those countries.
Can I bring in a country that has gone a lot further down the track on trying to police speech than we have yet here, and that's Britain. I'm just going to share, display the give me a minute. This is the in the UK they have prohibitions on hate speech. This is the UK Crown Prosecution Service definition of hate speech. I'll just read it. It's on the screen. Any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's disability or perceived disability, race or perceived race, religion or perceived religion, or sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, or transgender identity or perceived transgender identity. So hostility or prejudice. So they give a clarification of what's meant by hostility. There is no legal definition of hostility, so we use the everyday understanding of the word, which includes ill will, spite, contempt, prejudice, unfriendliness, antagonism, resentment, and dislike. So that's what it says. Now, as the Americans like to say, you could indict a ham sandwich on that basis. The terminology, the complete subjectivity of it. And indeed, the Crown Prosecution Service boasts of carrying out 15,000 prosecutions a year, I think, at one stage, for all manner of things. So if you say something a bit untoward, even if it's not actually strictly illegal, you might receive a visit or a phone call from Sergeant Plod wanting to look into your thinking without being the thought police or anything, they say. The effect of this in terms of on speech is actually quite stark. I'll just post this on the screen. This is in Britain. A third of Britons feel they are denied freedom of speech. This is the result of a YouGov poll. A third of people in Britain believe they cannot speak freely on controversial subjects such as immigration and religion for fear they may be criticised or lose their job or be prosecuted. The study by the New Culture Forum, a Westminster think tank, warns that Britain has developed a culture of silence where people censor themselves in the workplace. And according to YouGov, more than a third, 36%, believe they cannot speak freely on immigration. Now, thing about that is, that one of the papers, the Gelber paper we discussed before, wanted to argue that the effect of in dampening speech or curtailing speech of hate speech laws is very slight, but that seems to point to a very significant difference. And you have this underlying sentiment which can't be expressed. And
well, that's the self-censor. I agree with that, Peter. I think the UK right now is an absolute disgrace on free speech. It started with Blair and it moved through Cameron and Theresa May. And I've got to hope that Boris, who's got this ability to, Boris has certainly said things that would fall under those sort of definitions. A lot of it is quasi-criminal. And so a lot of people justify it by saying, well, we're not really criminalizing it. But they keep a record of you, and you're sort of this, you're not prosecuted criminally, you're prosecuted administratively. It's not really a prosecution. And then, the bad consequences are manifold. You then send the police out to police speech, and some notorious cases, somebody was picked up for quoting a Winston Churchill speech. Somebody was picked up for quoting Shakespeare. And the problem is that the sort of effectiveness of the police, to a large extent, is premised on at least the lower middle class people having confidence in the police. When you undermine that core confidence in the police amongst the sort of bourgeoisie, if you want to be a Marxist, you've got a real problem as a police force. I think we're starting to see that with the coronavirus. I mean, I grew up in a lower middle class house where the police would always be believed, and we just had a lot of confidence in the police. But when you see them going around ticketing people sitting by themselves, or in the UK giving you a sort of quasi-criminal ticket for quoting Winston Churchill, when they come around and start wanting your help, my inclination is to tell them to piss off. I don't want anything to do with what they're doing, even when it comes to enforcing the coronavirus stuff, because they're becoming so heavy-handed. I sort of have the same view about the ridiculously over-the-top policing of speed limits when someone's going 82 and an 80 and getting a ticket. This really undermines confidence in the sense and sensibilities of the police. And in the UK, they have gone completely crazy, in my view, on limiting speech in this sort of way. And we look a lot better than them on that sense. I have some hopes in Boris. I mean, Boris famously once compared a Muslim woman wearing the full burqa to a mailbox with the slits in the eyes. And somehow Boris has this incredible ability to say things that would kill the political career of just about anyone else. It doesn't touch him. He's like Teflon because he's funny. He's extremely intelligent. People during the Brexit debate, the Remainers were writing off Boris, but what they never went on to tell you is he won a scholarship to Eton. He didn't go there because his parents paid. He won a scholarship, and I think he got a first at Oxford. I'm pretty sure about that. He's a really smart guy. His political genius, Boris, is in being able to talk to everyday people without appearing to be really smart. He can talk at the level of the ordinary person. He's self-deprecating. He's funny. And it always seemed to me that Boris had an instinctive sort of libertarian streak. And I'm hopeful that when, assuming and hoping he does recover, that after they get through Brexit and after they get through the ruined economy, he will move to start dealing with some of these overbearing speech limitations. I think that's his core instinctive sort of outlook. I don't know that. It certainly was not the outlook of David Cameron, Theresa May, or Tony Blair. So I hope that it is a disgrace, the situation in the UK. I think he might fix it. I don't know how many other people noticed that on the Easter weekend, Boris was in ICU for 3 days, and then they pushed back the rock from the door of the ICU unit, and he went up a few floors to the regular unit, Boris. But he's going to be politically untouchable if he recovers. I think he's got the right personality. But I really hope he goes and does something to deal with this terrible situation on speech in Britain.
Okay, Richard Stiles, if you say there are some things that should be censored, what limits of speech would you advocate?
Well, I'm pretty much, I think most of the limits that the Supreme Court in the US puts on speech, not many, inciting actual violence at the time, I would stop that. If someone's trying to get a group of people to kill someone, I would stop that speech. I think you can just run through the limits that the U.S. Supreme Court puts on things. There are some limits on obscenity, child pornography. They allow limits on speech where the goal of the government is content neutral. So obviously you might allow limits on speech where, say, someone moves into a gated community and the gated community says, and you knew when you bought the house that, say, you had to paint your house a certain color, right? It was part of the deal because it keeps the values up for everyone else. And the goal isn't to suppress speech because of its content, right? You're not saying right-wing people can't do this, but left-wing can. And so those content neutral limits on speech, I don't really have a problem with, right? There's all sorts of limits on our speech that you would think of as content neutral. You're not limiting the speech because you don't like the substantive content of the speech. You're limiting the speech for non-content based reasons. And I don't have a problem with those. And again, we can just run through the list. I think there's all sorts of examples where there would be 1 in a million people who would say, yes, I think we ought to be, publishing all the names of CIA agents in countries around the world when you know they're going to get killed. I don't want to do that. I don't really think that's a particularly good idea. So I would put limits on speech. But again, you have to realize the debate we're having is not a black and white one. It's where do you see yourself on the spectrum of limits on speech? And I'm really at one end of the spectrum. I don't want too many limits. But I think that I think I mentioned this last week, once a year I'll go to a libertarian conference. I like going to libertarian conferences, but some of them I think are crazy. Some of the people are crazy. Anyone who says I don't want any limits on speech, it's a very hard line to hold. Now, of course, if you want me to, my particular list of limits on speech isn't going to line up with anyone else's. I'm at the not too many, very few limits on speech. It's a bit like comparing the constitutional legal limits on speech in the US to Germany, the UK, Canada, or Australia. There's fewer in the US, a lot fewer, but there are some. And a shorthand answer for you would be, I'm pretty happy with most of the limits that you find in the US. The trouble is you can't import that.
Okay, Enrico Brick, as a consequentialist like you, Jim, I'd be keen to explore a system of prima facie rules that assess arrays of non-trivial harm beyond offence and set those off against the default value of liberty.
Sorry, I got sort of waylaid looking at the Van Gogh or whatever the little picture is. Yes, I tend to agree with that. Again, people, when you do the hard work of coming up with the particular limits you're going to put on speech, we're not gods. People are going to disagree. Somebody's got to make the call. I prefer the call to be made by Parliament, but that doesn't mean the call that Parliament makes is very good. I think when you look at the history of bringing in the Section 18C, it was done even with some members of the Labour Party at the time objecting to it. I think it was a terrible call. And the problem is that this is a pretty good rule of life in the West right now. But whenever the left brings in limits that can be categorized as culture war limits, including limits on speech, when the right of center party comes into power, it never does anything about it. So they'll object to a Bill of Rights, but once it's enacted, they won't do anything about it. They'll object to a limit on speech, but when they get into power and they have the Senate and the House the way Howard does, they won't do anything about it. Now, to be fair to Howard, I guess that was before the Bolt case, and had someone gone after Bolt, maybe John Howard would have done something about it. But right of center parties tend to fold like a limp noodle whenever they're actually presented with an opportunity to maybe do something to rewind the clock. They won't do it. And that's a pretty universal rule. And so the problem is that with every incursion, you hardly ever see a winding back of the incursion. I have some hope with Boris that he might wind back some of the incursions in Britain. But he's in a very unique set of circumstances, right? He's won a big Brexit victory. Hopefully he doesn't use up all his capital on that. And then he might start going after the appallingly one-sided judges who decided some of those Brexit cases, bring in some limits on the creeping judicialization of politics in the UK. I think he needs to do that in the first 5 years, and then he can start going after the laws. But you'd have to be a brave person to say you imagine the Morrison government will ever do anything about Section 18C. I don't see it. I think half of the party room of the current coalition government likes Section 18C. We know some of them do because they've written articles. Julian Leeser is all in favor. He might tone it down a little, but some of the MPs out there, they might as well, as far as I'm concerned, be in the non-free speech party. And so I don't have a lot of optimism that anytime soon a coalition government will tackle these things. In a way, we're talking in the realm of theory. You just have to hope that somewhere down the line, somebody will actually do it. I had a lot of hopes in Abbott, and I think he handled it wrongly. Brandis was a disaster as an attorney general, maybe the worst attorney general from the Liberal Party ever. Judicial appointments have been terrible. And, the way he handled the repeal of Section 18C was effectively incompetent.
Okay. America George Bowman. Only one person has to believe it, I presume hate speech, or rather be supported by it to try and hurt or kill the target of the hate speech.
Yeah, well, that's just another slippery slope argument. You could say that about anything. You could say we should have a law to stop anything that's theoretically possible. And you might say, yeah, why don't we have a law against everything? Because it only takes one person. If you don't have strong laws about health and safety laws, we could cash that argument out again in terms of health and safety. And so you might as well have the most red tape on the planet. And actually, Australia pretty much does have the most red tape on the planet, and green tape, because it only takes one defective mind. It only takes one anything, and then the whole world comes crashing down. And then all of a sudden you find you're living in a country with the highest minimum wage in the world. That's Australia. It's a country with the least flexible labor relations pretty much in the democratic world. We've got the highest energy costs in the world, because you never know. It only takes one set of circumstances we can imagine. And so I reject those sorts of arguments, those slippery slope arguments. It's true that theoretically there's always this possibility, but you can't on that basis. And the problem is you then have an economy that's inflexible. Australia, we have, when I got here in 2005, it had the cheapest energy costs in the democratic world. Now we're the most expensive. I don't know why anyone would imagine that someone who has capital and wants to invest would want to come to Australia, barring having a huge sort of mineral resource stuck in the ground you can't find anywhere else. But you're just, everything is so red tape and inflexible. And often it's driven by this view that, well, we have to imagine the worst possible scenario and then regulate for that. And even France and Britain don't do that in these other realms. So I think that sort of argument is theoretically true, but if you go down that road very far, you're regulating yourself out of existence.
Okay, next, philosophy and critical thinking. Question for Jim Allen. What are your thoughts on the argument that only focusing on not constraining speech ignores the ability for those with a large platform able to drown out dissenting voices?
So there was a famous British judge named Lord Devlin. And Lord Devlin was a great British judge in the 60s. He stepped down from the then highest, they used to call the highest court the House of Lords. But he was a great judge, and he stepped down early. And he was a big Democrat, and he used to say a lot of sort of academic types or elite types, they want to give more say to their own groups like themselves, like the Senior Common Room or the Davos man, because they don't really trust your average person. He said, you don't do that. Now, he said, it's just a fact that some people are more intelligent than other people, and some people are more articulate. And those people will always have more scope to get their view disseminated across society. It's not easy to get a 1,000-word op-ed accepted by the Australian. I remember when I got here, I sent about 20 to them before I got one accepted. It's not easy to write those things, and it takes work. You have to be lucky in terms of your genetic inheritance. And those sort of people, said Devlin, will always have more scope to have their views. anybody who thinks that they would not want that to be the case must imagine a world where you have a sort of Marxist-like equality of outcome, and you allocate one op-ed per person until you've gone around the entire population. It's a bizarre equality of outcome type desire. So yes, if your point is that we live in a world where some people have won the genetic lottery in some way or other, they're exceptionally good looking. Every study they've ever done shows that good looking people, male and female, get a higher salary for their based on the credential for credential, get a higher salary, do better. I mean, who wouldn't rather be hanging around with an attractive person than an unattractive person? We all would, pretty much. And so there's all sorts of ways in which you win the lottery of life. Just being born in Australia, you're doing better than 99% of people on the planet. Or that's an exaggeration, 80% of people on the planet. And being born in the year 2000 and, whatever, if you're born in the last 20 years, the worst off person in Australia today has a better standard of living than King Henry VIII. Just go down the list, right? And so you've already won the lottery. And so, yes, in a sense, if you want to see the world in terms of unfairness, if that's your goal, and you want to force everyone to put on the spectacles of unfairness, then of course some people are going to have less scope to influence debate in society than others, because they're just not as intelligent, or they're not as articulate, and they don't work as hard at trying to get their views across. Yes, and yes. And the remedy for that is not to impose some sort of government-sanctioned gatekeeper bureaucracy. That's just never going to be overcome. What you're going to get is that you're going to get a new hierarchy, a new sort of Politburo, and their views will get disseminated more than anyone else. So there are some things in life that cannot be overcome. The best you can do, and I've always been a partisan of this, is to give everyone an equal say in choosing the leaders. And in democracy, we don't shut out people because they're, only have a 90 IQ. Everyone gets an equal say to everyone else, which drives a lot of people in universities crazy. They don't like democratic decision making. They prefer rule by the lawyerly cast of judges, and they prefer rule by international law, international law hasn't got a democratic bone in its body, right? And they prefer that. I don't like any of that. So if you want to drill down to the most egalitarian decision-making process ever known to man, and I include women when I say man for all of the crazies out there, it's democracy. And now that fixes a lot of the problem, but it doesn't fix all of the problem. And so if you go looking for unfairnesses, yes, it's true. We live in a world where some people are born with a better, they've had a better roll of the genetic dice than other people. And that can cash out in many ways. And one of those ways is that some people are better at influencing debate than others. Yes. And if you think you can remedy that with some sort of heavy-handed government sort of bureaucracy, I just think that you're going to find that the cure is a lot worse than the disease.
Okay. A Bark fan, Madeline. Yes, but you mustn't speak the truth about anyone who isn't white. Only white people can be spoken about hatefully, especially if they're male and or Christian.
Yeah, well, that's just a statement that seems to reflect the current state of affairs to a large degree. I suppose you could be Elizabeth Warren, say you identify as a Native Indian, and then you're free.
Just on that, this is interesting. There's a program on the ABC called The Minefield on Radio National, and this is an episode I happened to hear about 18 months ago, I think it was. It's compared by a guy called Scott Stevens, and it was Scott Stevens that compared together with two critical race academics talking about, and the title of the program was Wrong to be White. But Scott Stevens, partway through, said this, and I sort of almost fell off my chair when I heard it. The great moral debility about being white is that people have willfully chosen the trinkets and accoutrements of the accretions of power and privilege over a much more fundamental bondedness with other human beings. I mean, that is, if you were speaking in a theological register, we would call that a tremendous or even radical sin. That is, being white is a tremendous or even radical sin. It's almost echoes of the old, racist Calvinist idea that black skin was the mark of Cain. I just find that absolutely.
Does that surprise you on the ABC, Peter?
Sorry?
Does that surprise you on the ABC?
Yes, actually.
Okay, well, you can still be
this sort of
surprised
stuff all the time in social media on Twitter.
I know. Well, and it's usually not often worse than that, because sometimes these sort of lines are being pushed by, I don't know, a Cornel West or someone who's black or whatever. But often these arguments are pushed by white people.
Well, they were all white people.
They were all white. You see, they have somehow managed to step above the original sin that they cast on all other white people. And it's analogous to when people run affirmative action programs. And you see it across all sorts of bureaucracies in the universities, and some of the strongest supporters of affirmative action. So they want to hurt the chances of young white males in favor of females, minorities. Some of the biggest pushers of this line are themselves white males, and it's so hypocritical. If they actually believe that they have gained from this, then they should step down. I've always said this. Any white male who pushes this line should leave his job immediately, and we will guarantee that the job is taken by a woman or a minority. But they never step down. So they, on their own view, not mine, but on their own view, they have benefited throughout their life as being a white male. And then they get to benefit again in the virtue signaling, feel good about them sense when they stop using merit as the criterion for hiring, and they use some other criterion. So again, as I said last week, I have two kids. If you have a boy and a girl, everyone knows with the brain that the girl's got a better, all things being equal, she's going to get the benefit of the doubt. And it's often driven by white men who shamelessly, push these sort of things in a virtue signaling sense where they don't pay any of the costs. I'm against all affirmative action, but it's quite similar with this. You get these white people talking about how terrible it is to be white. But as I said last week, or I said maybe not here, I was talking on another show, maybe on that one, but if you look around the world for a society which is the least racist ever to have existed, you would pick Australia today, Canada today, Britain today. Anybody who wants to point to a non-white society that wasn't sort of overwhelmingly of a white sort of history until 20 years ago, you're going to find a more racist society. I've traveled all through Africa, all through Asia, and person for person, government policy for government policy, we are the least racist place going, and nobody wants to talk about that. And people who don't agree with that can point to, I invite them to point to countries outside of the wealthy sort of Western democracies and tell me where their idea of a less racist society is. So effectively what they want you to do is to feel guilt over something you had no control over. I don't feel any guilt about being white. I couldn't control it any more than I don't see any reason why someone in the 60s should have felt guilty about being black. You can't control that. And these pontificating people who want everyone else to feel guilty for things they can't control, when they somehow manage to step outside the constraints they're imposing on everyone else. The ABC these days should be ashamed of some of the shows they run.
What I find depressing, I've had a long political career, over 25 years as a partisan of the Labor left. But when I first got involved in politics, the quintessence of progressivism when it comes to race is Martin Luther King's famous statement that he looks forward to a day when his children are judged by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. But nowadays, the current progressivism is obsessed with race. It's extraordinary.
They actually take the exact opposite view, that race determines just about everything. Well, whether you can be heard, whether your view has any merit. Even the American Civil Liberties Union, which used to be, the most Martin Luther King organization in that sense, now is the exact opposite. This identity politics. Again, I encourage people to read Douglas Murray's new book. It's a tour de force, and The Madness of Crowds. It's just excellent, and it goes through some of the insidious craziness of some of this stuff, I can just say that the best thing you can do as an individual is just out loud tell people you disagree and you think it's crazy. Because often these people running this line or these lines, they don't expect anyone to stand up to them. It's true that some of them will just turn around and call you a racist, but not all of them. And often they've never heard anyone stand up to them. And so if you do, you at least raise the cost on them spouting some of this nonsense. So that's a thing we can all do. We can all say, I don't agree with that. I think that's crazy. And I think most people in Australian society would agree with us, the people saying this is crazy. Some people are afraid to because, again, one of the problems with a lot of inhibiting of speech is that people start to self-censor.
Okay. Gouda Froyer. That must be some Celtic name. What about the harm to children and young people, the next generation, being exposed to hate speech and it fueling discrimination and bias when they reach adulthood? The young people exposed to hate speech.
Well, I guess the questioner is just assuming those facts. I mean, first of all, we have to have a little bit of an idea of what the person considers to be hate speech. And, it's in Australia, it ranges right down supposedly to taking offense. And again, that clearly isn't true. But yes, if we take racial vilification as a sort of archetypical example of hate speech, and most of us would say, in terms of what we mean by the label, we would mean that. Yes, I've said a million times that does have harms. On the other hand, it's good. There's some good consequences in finding out the people who actually believe this stuff, this garbage, countering them, knowing who they are, getting resilient children, teaching them that, there's some people out there with crazy ideas that aren't, and, that's a good chance to teach your kids to be a little more vigorous. And there's no point in people not knowing it's out there, or at least the point of it is not obvious to me. So yes, I think there are some people out there with some deranged ideas, and keeping it secret is not obviously the way to go, to my way of thinking. Peter, I got about 5 more minutes.
All right. Right. Well, thank you, Jim. That's been terrific. Now, I'd just like to apologise. We've got heaps more things on the chat window, so we're just obviously not going to get through them. But in the coming period, we're going to open up the website for continuing debate.
Peter, I'm happy to give you a power of attorney and delegate you to answer for me.
Yeah, well, there's so many. I mean, we're getting towards an hour and a half, so I think we'll probably have to call it a day. But I'm sorry, but thank you very much, Jim, for coming in.
Okay, well, my pleasure, and I'm happy to step in. I'm sorry that the scheduled speaker wasn't able to do it, but thanks, Peter, and I'm sorry I have to cut out a bit early. Okay.
Right. Well, I think that's about it for today. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to schedule these online chat, these sessions on a weekly basis. Normally, with the physical meetings of the forum, we try to aim for a fortnightly sequence. But I'm quite attracted to the idea of having some sort of informal group discussions combined with the online chat, and we might be in a position to kick that off next weekend. Anyway, that'll be in the email. So I'd like to thank everybody who's joined in. We've had a good audience. It's been over 100. It's now drifted down to about 80. So that's after an hour and a half. So that's pretty good. So one thing I would ask you is if it'll be helpful if you can click the subscribe button on the video. There's a few things that become available once we reach a threshold number of subscribers. So if you can do that, please do so. But with that, I'll say goodbye for today. And again, sorry we didn't get through everything that's been posted. There's a lot of interesting stuff we didn't reach. All right. Bye.